Good evening, everyone, and blessed be. This is your host, Aries StarWind, and this is another episode of Readings at the Witching Hour. We're reading the book Wiccan Beliefs and Practices by Gary Cantrell, and this book is with rituals for solitaries and covens. So we finished chapter 2 before, and now we're getting finally started on chapter 3, which is actually titled Getting Started. So now that we had the introductory done, it's time to really get started on the practice of Wicca itself. So I'm excited to start this chapter with everybody, and I hope you all enjoy. Getting started. In Wicca, most of our work is done within the confines of specifically purified and consecrated space known as a sacred circle. In that circle will be the worshippers and all the various objects, tools, and instruments used in the performance of our rituals and rites. The first part of this chapter describes the tools and instruments that are an integral part of our ceremonies. We will discuss the items you will need in performing your own rituals and rites, how to perform them, and how to protect them when not in use. The second part of this chapter discusses the basic preparations for performing the rituals and the rites, such as casting the sacred circle, invoking the deities, and closing the circle when the ritual is ended. The actual performance of specific rituals and rites will be discussed in succeeding chapters. You will also read references to the goddess position and the god position relating to some rites or rituals. The goddess position is generally taken by the high priestess or other priestess and is done with the legs slightly spread, arms stretched from the shoulders with palms up, and the head up or slightly drawn back. The body in this position essentially forms a pentagram. The god position is generally taken by the high priest or other priest and is done with the feet together and the arms crossed at the chest. The fingers of both hands are curled into a loose fist, with the exception of the first and little fingers, which are extended to form the horned symbol of the god. If necessary, both positions can be assumed from a sitting or kneeling stance by just using the arm or hand positions. Generally speaking, holding the arms outstretched over the head in a V symbol is a position used by all practitioners, regardless of gender, during many invocations. If you are working in a coven environment, the high priestess or high priest usually takes responsibility for the tools and implements typically used by the coven as a whole. This is the case particularly if the home of the high priest or high priestess is normally the location for the coven meetings, which is generally referred to as the covenstead. These implements might include virtually anything used in the sacred circle, with the exception of the covener's personal atham, mirror book, and personal book of shadows. However, practitioners may wish to perform spiritual or magical work alone on occasion, and solitaries obviously need to have their own set of working tools. It is quite logical, then, for all practitioners to have a complete set of tools at their own disposal. The mirror book and the book of shadows. You will need to start keeping 2 books devoted to your path through the old religion. Whether or not these are 2 individual books or just one actual volume with internal separations is up to you. It has been my experience that the 2 should really be separate volumes. These books deal with 2 somewhat separate subjects related to our progress as a witch, and I personally found early on that trying to put both subjects into the same volume quickly made it too large and unwieldy. Your mirror book may rapidly grow into more than a single volume, depending of course on how much material you wish to record in it. The choice is yours, and you can always change the way you handle these books later on. The mirror book. The mirror book is essentially a diary, an account of your growth as a witch. In it, you should keep dated notes on the Sabbat or Esbit rituals you attend, your feelings and impressions about the rituals, what you did to participate, and anything special related to your coven or yourself. Later on, as you begin to work magical rites, it will be a place to note the reason for a spell, how and when it was cast, your thoughts and feelings afterwards, and the results. It can be as detailed as you want to make it, from a simple paragraph to multiple pages for each entry. The degree of detail is totally up to you, but it should be sufficient to enable you to recall the events surrounding what you have written months or even years earlier. The mirror book can also contain information about the things you learn or are taught in the coven, although I do not feel it should be used as a working textbook or notebook since it is too personal for that purpose. If you are attending formal classes, or even taking notes during general craft discussion sessions, you might want to consider using a separate book for that purpose and not your mirror book. Your mirror book should not be loose leaf or spiral bound, but rather something with a permanent binding, such as a theme book, which can be purchased from a stationery store or any store having an office or school supplies section. You should make your entries as soon after the event as possible, in ink. The reasoning behind this is that the mirror book is supposed to represent your impressions, your feelings, and sometimes your personal thoughts. As such, the writing should be done as soon as possible after the event, and it should not be altered or amended later due to second thoughts, since your first impressions are generally the ones that will be the most accurate and sufficient. I personally write in my mirror book on every other page. Although this is admittedly not a very conservative use of paper, it does leave me a blank page that I can go back to later in order to note some of my second thoughts about a particular incident or ritual, or to record the results of spell work. As you will learn later, magical work does not always have an immediate and obvious result, and it may not be until much later that you realize the work was effective. There should be space in your mirror book on which to write the results, even if they occurred weeks or even months after the work was done. The mirror book is a very personal document, and next to your own Book of Shadows, it is the one and most important books in your library. As such, you should protect it accordingly. Do not leave it on your coffee table for the casual visitor to thumb through. Use it to make your entries or read what you have previously written, and then put it safely away. I, coming from the author, keep mine in my office bookcase next to my Book of Shadows, but neither volume is marked on the outside in a way that reveals the contents. The Book of Shadows. Your Book of Shadows is your craft workbook containing all your ritual and spellcraft information. It is your working guide to your written invocations, rites, and spells. The Book of Shadows can also include Sabbath observance, details about theology, foods, practices, and such, as well as directories and internet links to pagan or Wiccan sources and stores. Additionally, it may contain information relative to the mysteries and teachings of your tradition. Thus, given the quantity and quality of the information it contains, it must always be protected. It must never be intentionally shown to those outside of the craft, nor should it be left out in the open where others may inadvertently have access to it. When not in use, keep it safely put away. Some covens maintain a coven Book of Shadows. This coven book is usually under control of the High Priestess, who is responsible for any changes to the contents and for its protection. It is the workbook used in all coven rites and rituals, and sometimes for teaching the mysteries. As part of your training into a tradition, you may be asked to copy this book, or at least parts of it, by hand, as the basis of beginning your own personal Book of Shadows. If you are an initiate into one of the more traditional paths or traditions, you may be oath-bound to never reveal the contents of the Coven Book of Shadows to any person who is not initiated into that tradition. A Book of Shadows is a working document, and, as such, is subject to changes and updates. A loose leaf binder generally is appropriate, although some practitioners prefer to write their personal Book of Shadows in a hardbound volume. I, coming from the author, personally believe that using a hardbound volume makes the book too awkward to use, particularly if you are trying to repeat a spell or other magical work that had been changed for some reason, sometimes more than once. The changes can make the text too hard to read, particularly by candlelight, which could conceivably lead to confusion or mistakes in the ritual or magical work you are trying to accomplish. The alternative to changing the text or the rite of a spell in the hardbound book would be simply to rewrite it from scratch on the next unused page. This can be time-consuming, though, and you might very soon find all your information on, say, healing spells scattered throughout the entire volume in no particular order. I have found a loose-leaf notebook to be much easier to use, since it lends itself easily to either major or minor reorganization as the user deems fitting. That brings us to the floppy disk of shadows. According to tradition, a book of shadows should ideally be done in ink, and it's the witch's own handwriting. But in this day and age of the affordable home computer, I must confess that writing a ritual or spell using a word processor has some distinct advantages, such as ease of editing for one. Although I expect that some practitioners might scream at this, I personally find nothing wrong with generating the text of a ritual or rite on a word processor and then printing the text on hard copy for inclusion in a book of shadows. I personally draw the line at keeping a book of shadows only on a computer disk and printing out the desired pages as they are needed for ritual work. In the first place, I feel that not having the actual book available during a ritual or magical rite distracts from the performance of that ritual or rite. Secondly, the Book of Shadows, particularly the Coven book, if you are working in a group, can be an integral implement of the sacred circle. It sits on or in front of your altar. It is part and parcel of your sacred tools, and it belongs to the circle just as much as the altar candles and your other tools. Lastly, it simply goes too far against tradition for me personally not to have an actual book to work with. Having said all that, I think that doing your rituals, rites, and spells either by hand or with a word processor is equally acceptable, though you really should have all the materials printed on pages as a physical volume and not just stored on a computer disk. Tools and instruments. There are many tools and implements used in witchcraft, and although I believe this part of the book is rather complete, there may be an instrument that I have inadvertently neglected to include. In that case, I apologize for any unintentional oversight. This section is meant to describe our general tools and instruments, so there may be some specialized items that are not included. The tools are listed in alphabetical order and not in any order of importance or use. Please remember that before any tool or instrument is used in the circle, it must be purified and consecrated. There is a suitable consecration rite described in Chapter 5, and it, or one like it, that you can devise on your own, should be used with every new tool or instrument. Once a tool has been purified and consecrated, it must only be handled by other people who have themselves been consecrated to the god and goddess. Your altar. Your altar can be either permanent or something you set up each time it is needed, or you can have both. It should be at least large enough to hold 3 candles: the goddess candle, the god candle, and the altar candle, as well as your salt and water dishes, the athames of high priestess and high priest, and the incense censer. Additional items, such as a small cauldron or chalice depending on the rite to be performed, and your Book of Shadows, can also be placed on the altar if there is sufficient room. Although we have a permanent indoor altar, I personally use a small wooden footstool our daughter made in a woodshop class at school for outdoor use. It is easily transportable and works quite well when draped with an appropriate altar cloth. Altar candles. There are generally 3 altar candles placed on this altar: a white goddess candle, a red god candle, and an altar candle representing of the ritual or rite being performed. The color of the altar candle for each Sabbat is suggested in the paragraphs detailing the individual Sabbats in Chapter 4, and can also be found in Table 2 at the end of this chapter. Various types of suitable candle holders can be found in either craft or novelty stores. We prefer to use votive candles rather than tapers, since the glass shell surrounding the votive candle gives the flame some protection from the wind when working outside. The altar cloth. The altar cloth is usually draped over the top and front of the altar. Its color is representative of the season, with the softer pastel colors generally used in the spring and early summer. Reds or dark greens can be used in summer into early fall, and orange or black are suitable in fall and winter. We are not quite so color specific in our coven, using white from Imbolc through Litha and black from Lugnasta through Yule. The altar cloth is not to be used for any other purpose. It should be folded and put away when not in use. The athame. The athame is generally a double-edged, dark-handled knife with a blade of about 5 or 6 inches in length. The blade edges are not sharpened. This is a tool used in many rites and rituals and is not usually considered to be a weapon. It is used to mark the perimeter of the circle, to stir the salt and the water used in consecrating the circle, and as a marking implement to carve words or symbols on candles, are used in candle magic. It can also be used as a phallic representation in such things as symbolic great rite. The athame is a personal tool and can be marked either on the handle or blade with your own unique glyph or sigil that is representative of your craft name taken at initiation. Your athame should be put safely away, wrapped in a white cloth, or stored in a white container. The besom. The besom is a sacred broom used to sweep away any lingering energies around the area in which a circle is to be cast. I personally do not own a besom and have yet to find a use for one, relying on purifying an area with sage in order to cleanse it for ritual work, but this is up to you. If you feel the need to use one, then by all means do. They can usually be purchased in craft shops or, failing that, try novelty or home craft stores for any small broom. If necessary, you can make your own with an old broom handle and any piece of wood of a suitable length and some twisted straw or grass tied in a bundle at the end. The bowline. The bowline or herb harvesting knife is a small and very sharp white-handled knife with a curved blade resembling a small sickle. The blade is generally made of copper, not steel. It is used to cut herbs and for nothing else, and whether or not you need one will depend on your own requirements. The bowline should be put safely away when not in use. The cauldron. A cauldron can have many uses, from holding a small balefire on Beltane to functioning as the female counterpart to the male athame in the symbolic great rite. It is also used to burn any incantations used in spell work or to burn a covener's written request to the deities during some rituals. They come in various sizes, and the size of the cauldron you require depends on its anticipated use. We use a small one of about a 1 quart capacity that seems adequate for all our needs. Any iron pot will do for this purpose, but the old-fashioned 3-legged black cauldrons, some emblazoned with a pentagram, are usually only available from craft shops. The chalice. The chalice is a glass or metal drinking goblet that is another of those tools for which I personally have found very little application. It can be used in the initiation rite when drinking a toast to the Lord and Lady, and it can also be used as the vaginal representation in a symbolic great rite. Some covens also use a single chalice in the cake and ale rite, passing it around the circle after being blessed by the high priest. However, the requirements for this use seem to be rather limited, and we have not found it necessary to procure one for our coven. They can be purchased with or without a pentagram marking. from many craft catalog sources as well as most craft shops. The incense holder. The type of incense burned at any ritual depends on the purpose of the ritual. A table of incense types with their suggested functions can be found in Table 3 at the end of this chapter. But generally speaking, I have found that sandalwood seems to be quite effective as a generic incense for most occasions. Whether you use stick, cone, or powdered incense is up to you, but I have found that sticks burn more reliably and with less bother than cones or sprinkles of powder used with a charcoal block. A censer is necessary for use with either cones or powder, but only some from a stick holder is needed with stick incense. Incense censers and incense stick holders can be purchased in virtually any store. The burning incense represents the elements of both air and fire in the circle consecration process and is some initiation or dedication rites. The pentagram symbol. The pentagram is a basic symbol of witchcraft. It is the focal point for spell work and is generally placed on or in front of the altar. Some altar cloths are emblazoned with it, or if you have a homemade altar cloth, you can purchase a pentagram tile or trivet to place on the altar. The altar candle can be placed on the pentagram or it can be used to hold the athame of the high priestess and high priest. The 5 points of the pentagram represent the elements of spirit, earth, air, fire, and water. They can also be identified in some rites or rituals as birth, initiation, consummation, repose, and death. Purifying sage. Sage generally comes in small bundles and is available from most craft shops. Once lit, it gives off a considerable amount of gray-white smoke that is a purification agent used to remove any negative or other unwanted energies from the area in which a circle is to be cast. Sage should be used the first time a circle is cast in a new area, and any time thereafter when the participants feel it necessary. Quarter candles. There are 4 quarters used in casting a circle, sometimes called guardians or watchtowers, with each represented by an individual colored candle. Yellow for east, air for south, yellow for east, air, red for south, fire, blue for west, water, and green for north, earth. These are placed at an appropriate cardinal point of the circle and form the perimeter edge of your circle that you will inscribe in your athame. A salt container. Salt is one of the purification agents used in casting a circle and is usually held in either a glass dish or seashell, the seashell being preferred. Any type of salt will do, and only enough salt is needed to give 3 small pinches that will be mixed with water. The salted water then represents the elements of earth and water for consecration of the circle and some initiation or dedication rites. A sword. The sword is one more of those coven instruments in which I personally have never found a use, although some prefer it over the athame when casting a circle. The choice is yours, but to me it seems to be an unnecessary tool since the athame works quite well. A wand. Like the besom and sword, the wand is something I have never used. There are many written rituals that specify its use, but again, I feel this is a personal choice since the athame works equally well in a place of the wand. However, if you feel the need for a wand, then by all means you should have one. It is probably preferable to make your own wand from a suitable length of tree branch that can be trimmed, sanded, and marked as you feel appropriate. And lastly, a water container. Water is another of the circle purification agents. The water container should be any vessel capable of holding water without leaking and of sufficient size to allow you to add 3 pinches of salt and stir with your athame. In addition to purifying the circle, the mix of salted water is also used in some consecration and initiation rites. I have a mini cauldron of about a 1 cup capacity that works quite well for this purpose. If you are using an iron vessel, make sure you rinse and dry it thoroughly before putting it away in order to prevent rusting. And there we have it. That is the section on the tools, pretty much for, getting started with your altar. I think that's a really good list of tools, and I think it's really nice that he basically explained which ones he uses and which one he doesn't. You're not necessarily bound to use every single tool, but you definitely want to use ones that you feel connected with and that are going to help you in your craft moving forward. So I really like that section of the chapter, and the next section is actually going to be clothing and preparation for the rituals itself. So we'll save that for the next segment, and that was a great piece. Sorry, I have really loud neighbors, if you can hear that. And I will see you all tomorrow night. Blessed be, and God is blessed.